I mean, in many parts of the U.S. now, the median family has no path to homeownership. For the first time, Americans are making the decision about where they live, both in terms of cities and then within cities, on the basis of, well, where can I just find an affordable home?
If I want to write my legislator, like, what should I be saying? Hey, I really like this, a kind of achievable thing that we could do.
There's no way we're going to solve these other problems as long as, it's just illegal to build more sustainably.
Today on the We Can Solve This podcast, I'm talking with my good friend, Nolan Gray, about the housing affordability crisis and just how we can have an effect on the issue. Nolan is a senior director for legislation research at California YIMBY, and he's the author of Arbitrary Lines, How Zoning Broke the American City and How to Fix It. In this episode, we talk about the housing affordability crisis, what it looks like, how people experience it, and also who the decision makers are in this policy issue. Who are the people that affect our lives in this way? And then, how do we actually do the work to have an impact? Whether that's community building, creating the content and media that's going to actually answer the questions that people have about the issue, and just doing the right thing and flooding the zone, as Nolan says. So with that, on with the show. All right, Nolan, welcome to the podcast, bud.
Hey, Calvin. It's good to be chatting.
Nolan, you've written about zoning, obviously. You've written it's a touchstone book at this point. I think a lot of people, being a first mover on this issue of zoning, Arbitrary Lines, How Zoning Broke the American City and How to Fix It. What's the big deal? How are American cities broken?
Yeah, the simple premise of the book is there's like 1,000 things that local policymakers and planners don't control that contribute to things like housing unaffordability and segregation and economic opportunity and environmental sustainability. We always hear about this. There's not enough money, interest rates are too high, these standards are federal, yada, yada, yada. But here was an area of policy, zoning, where it was like, oh, okay, this is something that local planners and policymakers and state policymakers can really change the policy and immediately improve people's lives. And so, there was a lot of chatter in the lead up to when I wrote the book in 2020 about, okay, there was kind of something like elite consensus of zoning is bad, zoning's a problem, we need to reform it. But I would find that even people who are broadly on my side would often talk about it in a way that suggested to me that they didn't actually have a clear sense of what zoning was. So that was problem number one of like somebody needs to sit down and write the book on like, this is just plain facts of this policy area. And it's kind of amazing. When you start learning about any policy space, you kind of quickly find all the people who are experts are not writing like the intro accessible content. And then all the people who are writing the intro accessible content are like, I'm just learning about this and I'm writing about this for myself. So it's like the people who most need to be writing the sort of plain language policy explainer are not the people writing it. So I wanted to do that. And then I also wanted to tie this into current events of importance to people. This is why you should care about this really wonky policy area. And then I really wanted to stress that this is something that's actively being fixed. So there's so many things going wrong in the world that it's not clear what the solutions are, or the politics don't line up around fixing it. And it's like, this is not one of those areas. This is an area where it's like, we know how to fix it and we're actively fixing it. So that's what I was trying to do with the book.
This is this is a policy area that no one really talks about, no one really knew about 10 years ago, right? 10 years ago, this is how you make people leave a room, right? But then Obama talked about it in the DNC speech this year or last year, right? This is starting to gain traction. So give us a quick breakdown. What the hell is zoning in the first place? And then what is the crisis that we're facing even?
Zoning is a form of local land use regulation. Here in the US, we do it at the local level. And essentially what we're doing is two things. For every single lot in the city, we're saying these are the allowed uses, and this is the allowed density or form that the building can take. So we're really micromanaging exactly what can be built on every single lot. So at a superficial level, zoning is very boring, but if you understand it, you can understand why your community looks the way it does. And so let's talk about uses. Most people who played SimCity, they know at a very high level, okay, residential, commercial, industrial. And it makes sense to keep certain industrial uses away from certain residential uses, of course. But the use rules go into so much more detail, prescribing things like, okay, here's the exact type of business that you can operate in the storefront. Here's the exact form of housing that you can build on this lot. Maybe you can build a single family home, but not a townhouse, right? So very, very detailed. In many cases, many cities have dozens of different use districts. The second thing is this density or the form that a building takes. So most people know about things like height limits and setbacks, but zoning will also say, for example, what percentage of the lot can be covered? How big do the yards have to be? How many units or how much floor area can you build on that lot? And as the title of my book would suggest, these rules are often kind of arbitrary, but they broadly suppress densities and they allow for the flexibility and incremental growth over time that traditionally I think was key to making cities healthy and affordable.
And you say arbitrary, but clearly there was some decision making that happened along the way. Do you like? I feel like I understand what arbitrary means, but in a sense, like, how would you describe this decision making? Is this simply like decision by committee where it's not really anybody's goal how we got here, or was it really like coordinated efforts to get to where we are with the level of stringent zoning that we have? I mean, I remember when I first learned about this, really, it was because I was working with you on that Dead Malls video on the first time. Like, I had never really thought about zoning, and then I'm looking into things like, damn, I didn't know these malls were only restricted to sell dry good retail and not like groceries, and that makes a lot of sense. And how come there aren't departments above the mall? Because that would make a lot of sense. Like, so it only just started to break open for me then. But like, all right, how do these decisions get made? Who makes these decisions? Why do they get made? Is this just like a pastiche collage of things, or is it like really coordinated?
Yeah, I mean, I can imagine you're like occasionally having an interstellar moment of like going back before you're working on that mall video and like pushing the book. They're like, don't go. Your life is going to be completely focused on zoning now. I'm happy you took that work. Oh, we've got many more videos, and for listeners, we have a happy and long abiding professional relationship. But it is fun. It's just funny to me to think that, yeah, that's how we first met, was that mall video when I was living in New York City. Yeah, I mean, the arbitrary nature is, I think, very important to stress, because part of what makes these rules so resilient is they have this kind of like technocratic scientific gloss, right? Like in other contexts, when you're given specific numbers, that means something. Like, okay, you need to change your oil every like so many thousand miles. You need to take exactly this much amount of this medicine. It's like, in general, when you're given a specific number, it's like that's been heavily studied, heavily vetted, and if you don't adhere to it, bad things are going to happen. And the thing is, like, none of that's true with zoning, even though it presents itself that way of like, oh, one FAR, floor area ratio of 1. It's appropriate that you should only be allowed to build 5,000 square feet of floor area on a lot that's 5,000 square feet. And it's like, okay, but where does that number come from? Like, why is the FAR 1? It's just basically chosen out of a hat one day. The vibes seemed right. And then it gets copy and pasted over and over and over again. And the more cities adopt it, the more it takes on this sort of impromptu of like, oh, well, this is just best practice. This is good planning. You see this in so many areas of planning policy, right? Of like, why are the specific figures or specific rules the way they are? Why are certain businesses that don't have an obvious nuisance consideration allowed here but not there? Why one parking space per 1,000 square feet of commercial? It's like you see this and you're like, well, surely somebody at some point really studied this and vetted this heavily. In the case of parking requirements, for example, you can go get older copies of the parking generation manual, and it will be based on fewer than a half dozen observations in one particular case. And there's this little warning at the side of the scatter plot saying, use carefully, small sample size. And it's like, they're kind of admitting like, this is not research. Like, this is research that like, if a student submitted it to me in an introductory statistics course, I would say like, please actually try a little bit and do a little bit of work. And yet these are like, this is the basis for like all of these things that control every single aspect of our lives, and have huge costs. So not only are the rules just harmful, but they're not even necessarily rooted in anything. They're totally arbitrary. And I think it was a little bit of like the punching the shark in the nose thing of like, no, like we shouldn't be taking these rules like at face value of like, these are good and smart and thoughtfully developed rules, but how do we tinker with them? I was like, no, this is kind of a giant arbitrary system that reflects like the accretion of like best guesses and cultural heuristics that have been copy and pasted from one city to the other for 100 years. And it's bad. It's not achieving what we want out of cities. I mean, just look around you, right?
I think everybody kind of generally knows what we're feeling right now. My generation feels like it's unaffordable to live in desirable cities. It's unaffordable to buy a home in even mid-sized cities. We're feeling that, but how do you describe the actual way that people are experiencing the housing crisis? You've written about like people living out of their cars. You've talked about, people having to leave towns. I mean, there's like the seen and unseen here, but describe a little bit about what this crisis actually looks like and experiences.
I mean, in many parts of the U.S. now, the median family has no path to homeownership anymore. The median home price is way more than 5 times the median household income. Historically, a healthy rate's like 3 to 5. In many California metros, it's 10 plus. So in many parts of the U.S., families have no path to homeownership. Rents, of course, have dramatically outpaced incomes. And so many cities suffer from severe shortages of rental housing to where vacancy rates of like 2 to 3%. Again, 5 to 10% is generally pretty healthy for a rental vacancy rate. When you're looking for an apartment, you want lots of apartments to be available. You want landlords competing for you. That's what keeps rents under control. But we have a severe shortage. And so we have a large and growing number of people who are spending over a third, or in some cases over half of their income on rent. Then, of course, we have some of the highest historic rates of homelessness. Folks not only sleeping in tents under overpasses, but sleeping in their car, sleeping on the couches of loved ones, staying at extended stay hotels. So on housing affordability, it's really just a 5-alarm fire in a lot of places. A lot of these rules are most acute in places with the most opportunity. So places like coastal California, places like the Northeast, places with amazing jobs, great cultural institutions, great educational institutions. And yet, if you want to move to these places, often the increase in your cost of living is going to dramatically increase relative to any increase in your potential to earn incomes. So for the first time in American history, Americans are moving from high opportunity places to lower opportunity places. And, that's not the end of the world, right? There are many reasons why folks move to a lot of different places. But for the first time, Americans are making the decision about where they live, both in terms of cities and then within cities, on the basis of, well, where can I just find an affordable home? And even within otherwise like pretty affordable metros, many folks might say, hey, well, I would like to be downtown near existing job centers or in a place where I can walk to restaurants and bars and cultural amenities. But they're finding, well, there's no housing production happening in these places. So the only place where I can afford a home is way out in the suburbs where I'm going to be dependent on cars. The fourth big piece here is equity, right? So a lot of these rules are explicitly predicated on the idea that people of different income levels should live in different parts of the city. And then, of course, in the U.S. context, of course, that has a pretty clear racial implication. So if you can say, hey, you're only allowed to live in this neighborhood if you can afford a single family home on a half-acre lot, and the government's going to ban you from building anything other than that, you can effectively place a minimum income floor on who is allowed to live in the neighborhood. And this is not like a bug. Like sometimes I talk about this and people are like, oh, well, that's like a weird misuse of zoning. And that wasn't what zoning was intended to do. This is what zoning was invented for. Like this is the main like original use case of zoning, was to segregate our cities. And then, of course, all of this is tied up with growing environmental consciousness. So if we have zoning rules that force our cities to sprawl out rather than grow up, we're going to consume more land. More people are going to be dependent on their cars. Fewer people are going to be able to walk or take a bus or bike to work. People just don't have options to do the more environmentally friendly thing. So on these four margins, zoning has just completely deformed our cities and is at the root of a lot of problems that we're trying to figure out.
So it sounds like you see zoning is a silver bullet policy, yeah? Like it's causing, or it's at least adding to some of the major issues we all talk about. We're talking about like racial divide and inequality. We're talking about the environment, not being able to, limit the use of, internal combustion engines because we have to, right? We're talking about obviously just general the economy, the strength of the economy being thrown asunder because now if you want to be more productive, we want a more productive economy, we are at a limit essentially with regards to labor. Right? Do you see this as a silver bullet policy that covers like so many other things?
I don't see it as a silver bullet in the sense of if you dramatically liberalize or abolish zoning, I don't think these problems go away. I think fixing zoning is necessary but not sufficient, right? There's no way we're going to solve these other problems as long as it's illegal to build anything other than a single family home in 90% of residential areas. We're never going to solve these problems as long as the most productive cities in America are unbelievably unaffordable. We're never going to solve these problems as long as it's just illegal to build more sustainably. So there are lots of other things that have to happen to solve a lot of these bigger issues. For example, here in California, the just cost per square foot to build housing is really expensive, and that's because of building code. That's potentially because of tariffs in the coming years. That's because of labor shortages. But as long as the housing is illegal to build, all that other stuff just kind of doesn't matter. So it's not a silver bullet in the sense of you do it and everything's solved, but it's necessary but not sufficient. It has to get fixed before we start making progress on these things.
From the title of this podcast, even I personally believe that this is a solvable issue. Like, we don't need alien technology to build housing for the 300 million people who live in America. Like, we just need to legalize housing, right? We need to just simply allow, housing built after 1970 to be like possible and efficient, right? So what are the real key issues that are at least actionable right now? Like, if I want to write my legislator, like, what should I be saying? Hey, I really like this, a kind of achievable thing that we could do. Or should it not even be a legislator? Should it be town council? I think, things like building housing on major transit lines, right? They're already in demand. I'm sure there's plenty of developers who want to do that already, but they aren't allowed. Is it permitting reform? Is it ADU reform? Is it parking minimums? What are those kind of major key things that you're saying, like, we should be just lambasting our local legislators and say, hey, these are things we can do right now in our own towns?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many possible directions to take this. I mean, so first on the issue of scale. So the US and Canada are unique in that these rules are all almost exclusively set at the local level. So like almost every other developed country, there's like a much larger role for the state, province, or even the national government. We don't do that in the US and Canada, for better or worse. So most of the reform can and should happen at the local level in the near future. Like going to your city council members and saying, hey, what are we doing on like zoning reform with respect to housing affordability? Showing up at planning commission meetings, et cetera. But the politics of reform often don't line up, especially in smaller, more exclusionary suburbs. And that's where you're going to need to take a lot of this action to the state level. And this makes sense, right? I mean, like, there just needs to be more consistent state level standards on a lot of this stuff, instead of this chaotic Holy Roman Empire patchwork of zoning rules that we have in a place like Los Angeles. There's 88 different cities in LA County. They all have a completely different zoning code that bears only faint resemblance to any other zoning code in the city, in the county. That's crazy, right? So some state level guardrails I think are really important. As far as specific interventions, I think it'll vary based on local context. So for example, in an urban context, it's really important to eliminate minimum parking mandates that force tons and tons of parking to be built above and beyond what developers and consumers actually want. So that's an easy one. Allowing for more, at least mid-rise multifamily housing. So Cambridge, Massachusetts recently completely overhauled its zoning to allow mid-rise multifamily in the entire city. And it's like, yeah, that's appropriate for a place like Cambridge. Like that's what we should be doing, getting a sort of Paris-style density and look and feel. In suburban context, it's stuff like legalizing other forms of housing, legalizing accessory dwelling units or small additional apartments, letting homeowners turn an unused attic or basement into an additional living space. It's things like reducing minimum lot sizes. So reducing the amount of land that you're legally mandated to consume if you want to have a single family home. Allowing for more homes on smaller lots that are more affordable is going to be really key.
So if we're talking about local laws, who is it? Who is the person? I mean, obviously it might change depending on how each kind of local municipality is set up, but like, who should I be thinking about? Or when I get my ballot every year, like I'm looking at it like, oh, who actually is responsible for some of these decisions that you're talking about?
At the end of the day, the buck stops with your local city council. So, especially, I mean, you got to get to a pretty big city before council members stop being responsive to individual inquiries. So like reaching out to your council member or your mayor or your any kind of at-large supervisor or anything of that nature, and just asking them like, hey, what do we, I send some resources and say like, this is the median home price in our community is X. The median rents in our community are Y. Here's how these stack up against incomes. I always tell people, tell your story too, right? Almost everybody our age has like housing horror stories, right? I lived in my car for a summer, right? Like because I couldn't find an affordable apartment in time in LA. I have no path to homeownership in LA. Those sorts of stories, those very personal stories, one, you're the expert, right? Like nobody can say, no, Nolan, you idiot. You can afford a home. You just need to do X, Y, Z. It's like, no. Like this is, or living out of my car. It's like, yeah, that was actually the best option for me, given like the total lack of like rental housing in LA. So like when you speak in terms of your personal experience with this issue or your concerns, You're the expert. People have to take you seriously. And then that can be teed up to say, okay, what are we doing about this? Like, there are tried and true reforms. I find that, especially when I'm talking to council members, another way to frame this is find a good comp for your city. So, for example, I'm from Lexington, Kentucky. Los Angeles and New York City, they're not good comps for Lexington, even if they're doing things that I think Lexington should do, or things that we should avoid. But you can say, hey, what about Raleigh, North Carolina? Raleigh, North Carolina got rid of their crazy neighborhood council review processes. What about Fayetteville, Arkansas? They got rid of parking requirements for all uses, and they're encouraging missing middle. If you can figure out what your city or your town's comp is, and then go find an example of a city or town or suburb like yours that's doing things the right way, that's also is hard to argue with, right? So that's really valuable. I would say just in general, make it really easy to adopt reform. Like, have everything ready to go, pat and easy, and then positive affirmation, I think, is more effective than sort of negative critiques or complaints. I mean, obviously, elected official or planner does a bad thing, needs to be called out, totally. But even more important is, like, when they do a good thing, saying, I really appreciate you leading on this issue, and we've got your back, and I'm going to be at the meeting to speak on behalf of your proposal when it goes to the planning commission or it goes to the council. That's so valuable, especially for, the planners, because it's like we do this kind of weird game where it's like the planners are supposed to be non-political, and they're totally dependent on, like, people showing up to back them up to have cover to do anything. And if they don't have that, often they can't really do anything unless they have, like, a city council member pushing them to undertake reform.
Are you talking a little bit from experience? Because I remember you were appointed to a local board for a time, or a local community group, right? Did you face a lot of political problems, or was that actually kind of like, it was kind of so niche that no one really kind of bothered you?
I mean, I was a planner in Queens, and it was such a big bureaucracy that nobody cares what the junior planners think about anything. And there was no movement around broader reform in New York City at that time. It does seem like now is like a lot more of a fun time to be a planner in New York City, just because, like, groups like Open New York have really cleared the runway for some positive reforms. So yeah, I mean, it's almost, in many jurisdictions, a planner having opinions can actually be kind of a professional liability.
I remember when I went to Lexington to cover a little bit of the ADU reform there. I remember the three city planners that were standing there. They looked kind of defeated a little bit, because they just had to, like, take a beating regarding, like, all this work they had done. Like I remember, like, they present their work, right? Here's our draft on the ADU, and actually at that point, it was actually the second draft. They had written a first draft. Tons of people showed up complaining about, this, that, and the other thing. A lot of them complained about, like, it's going to bring in more college students, and we don't like that, apparently. And so these, like, zoning guys, all three of them, they're just like, all right, here's our second draft, and they looked like they did not want to be there, because, yeah, I can imagine, like, they're just getting hammered. Is that kind of what most city planners are kind of experiencing?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's generally a bad, thankless job. It's one of the few jobs where it's like there's a cultural consensus that random crazy people can show up and yell at you. Look, as in any profession, there are people who are good and thoughtful at their job, and there are people who are bad and lazy at the job. But there's generally a toxic culture around planning in the U.S., and so that's frustrating. But this is where I get back to, like, if you care about this stuff, you have to show up. You have to speak on behalf of projects. You have to thank the planners when they're doing good work and call them out for praise, because you're just going to lose those people otherwise. And the person, if you have a good local planner who's really putting in the work and trying to make progress on this stuff, when you lose this person, you're going to get somebody worse. Like, because there's whisper networks, so to speak, of, like, planners quickly figure out if, like, this place sucks, like, there's crazy NIMBYs there, and the council members are assholes and they don't listen to us, and et cetera, et cetera. So, like, yeah, the most important thing too, a really important thing, is building a community. Like, you don't want it's so much better than nothing to be the one person at a public hearing that speaks on behalf of housing. That's huge. I don't want to downplay that, but you got to take that energy and then convert that into a broader community. You look at a place like Sacramento, and it's like, back in the 2010s, like, probably nobody was showing up speaking on behalf of housing except for the applicant trying to build it. Then we get to a point where it's like a few YIMBYs are at every public hearing, And it's like, oh, okay, neighbors are divided on this thing. And then it's to the point like last year when the city fully got rid of single family zoning and legalized sixplexes and fourplexes citywide. And it's like almost everybody at the hearing was a YIMBY. And it's like that's something that happened in a span of like maybe 5 years.
Wow.
That's crazy, right? And it's because the group in this case was HouseSac. They built a community. They had a monthly happy hour, monthly planning session. They were persistent. They were always there. They read the ordinances. They did the kind of basic work. And one of the beautiful things about this policy area too is it's so local and it's so kind of low stakes in a certain sense that like if you just show up and care, you can immediately start changing the discourse. So like showing up, building a community. I think another thing is like, especially with the death of traditional media, there's often nobody covering a lot of this stuff. Like nobody's covering like zoning and housing and development politics in the typical American mid-sized city. Or if they are, it's like some underpaid, underappreciated local journalist who's on like 3 different beats and has never received any training on zoning and is probably just going to go show up, write the standard article. Planning proposed this, but a bunch of neighbors complained XYZ. Who's to say if this is good or bad, right? Like that's the story they're going to write. But like, if you can like start driving the conversation on your own of like create like social media accounts that are covering this stuff and talking about this, blog about it, like flood the zone with content. In many cases, this is like a completely, I'm mixing all my metaphors here. It's like a totally empty field, right? Like there's nothing there. And like you can put yourself in a situation where it's like you paying attention to this and like blogging and sharing your opinions is like one of the only like thoughtful sources of commentary that's happening in your city. And you get to a point where it's like even people who disagree with you are like, oh, okay, like I disagree with this person, but so-and-so is the only person covering these issues for my community. So if I want to know what's going on, I need to read him or her. That's powerful, right? That's really powerful.
Wow. I mean, that's the playbook, right? Like you really do have to, for the city council members who make these decisions, you have to show them and like have them experience that, no, not all this neighborhood is exactly how this, town council meeting ended up feeling like, right? Like just like 20, 65-year-old and older, like retirees who really don't like how things are changing in the neighborhood, showing up, yelling at them. It really is, this neighborhood is a bit more diverse in its opinions and could be flooded with, like, no, we want more housing. Here are all these people who showed up who have no pathway to housing in our town that I thought was beautiful as a city council member, but then bam, I'm hit with the reality of what these guys are telling me about, and they're the people who, just need to come up and show up, right? Like that's the playbook?
Yeah, I mean, right? Half the battle's just showing up. I mean, that's huge. Show up at
G.I. Joe,
meetings.
right? That's a G.I. Joe point, right?
It's a G.I. Joe point. Well, interesting. Just be present, right? I mean, this is another thing I think a lot about. It's like, the people who are in the room are basically always going to be people who like and decide what happens. So like, showing up at meetings, depending on like your level of involvement, trying to get appointed as a commissioner. Again, this might sound like crazy to you, but like, unless you're in like New York City or LA, like it's trivially easy to get on like your local preservation commission or your local planning commission, or to say nothing of like any kind of neighborhood level review committee that your city might have. It's so easy to get on these things and to be influential. And then of course, if you're like a total charisma Chad and you live for this stuff, like running for office, same thing. It's easier than you would think to like get elected to like local office, again, unless you're in like a San Francisco or Boston. These are opportunities for you. So showing up, being physically present, building a community of people, like building up, this is key, right? The most successful groups, they're building a community, and they're building a community that is constantly creating new leaders, right? So like, okay, we're elevating the next generation. I see this happen, like groups that become too focused on one individual person, like essentially like cult of personality urbanist groups, they last only as long as somebody digs up old tweets of a person being crazy or that person loses energy. Like that's so not stable. There's no stable social movement that's structured that way. You got to be building up a lot of different leaders, touching base with a lot of different aspects of the community, making sure that your group reflects the broader community. I think a lot of YIMBY groups are doing that very effectively more and more. It's funny because you mentioned the thing about older retired, the prototypical NIMBY, the like old retired homeowner showing up. It's funny because I don't even know that definitely is like a type. And there's a great book on this, Neighborhood Defenders, kind of getting at this. But you go to like a lot of YIMBY meetups now, and there's a lot of folks of all ages, because it's like the housing crisis affects people, lots of people at different stages of their life in different ways, right? Like you might be a well-off older homeowner, but you're finding, oh, my young adult children can't afford a home here, and I never get to see them, or I never get to see my grandchildren. Or they're finding, oh, I really want to downsize. I don't want to do lawn maintenance. I want to be able to walk to a park or a coffee shop, but that housing just doesn't exist in my community. So you're breaking down like this usual stereotype of like, oh, the YIMBY is like the like angry young white or Asian guy who probably works in tech. This podcast is not helping with the stereotype, I'm sorry to say. But like the more mature the movement gets and the more thoughtful we get about this stuff, the less it like reflects that stereotype, and the more it like reflects broader community. So building communities is key. And that's like, I'm flying off the rails here, but this loneliness crisis stuff, it kind of drives me nuts, because it's like, you're lonely? Okay, have some friends over for dinner. Join a faith group, or like some sort of like volunteer group. These things exist. Like they're and then not only do they exist, but they're like thrilled when you show up.
Right. I mean, I got Bowling Alone. Like, he's really clear. Like, it's not exactly hard. Like, maybe there's a reason. It's TV or internet or whatever that we're like getting a little bit lonely. But like, you put effort in and you get dividends. I mean, like, you make friends. You've experienced the benefit of having friends. It's not even like an abstract thing where it's like, I'm hoping, 10 years down the road after making friends that'll result in good things. It's just like, it's very direct and immediate. And to your point, like with like housing affordability, it's like you just plug yourself in, put effort in, and you'll start to build a real community. It might take 5 years, but what's 5 years when, it's of just applying effort and getting better housing at the end of the day, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, what's this? This might be another G.I. Joe quote. Is like, you overestimate what you can accomplish in a year, you underestimate what you can accomplish in 10 years, right? I mean, we're already seeing that in, so it's like, yeah, the first year of you showing up at hearings and speaking your piece, the first year of you, let's say, posting on Blue Sky, the first year of you blogging, the first year of you hosting happy hours, all that stuff might not mean anything. You dozens, hundreds of followers, the same 3 or 4 people showing up at the happy hour. But like, these things catalyze, and you never know when that's going to happen, but the longer you put the work in, the more likely they are to catalyze into something much bigger. And I've just seen this happen like dozens of times in a lot of cities where people confidently told me, oh yeah, there's no YIMBYism here. It's not going to work here. And it's like, I check in 2 or 3 years later, and it's like, no, there was some local policy entrepreneur who like made it happen. I would stress too, the media production stuff, because I know this is near and dear to your heart. It's so key. I think something that is so exciting to me now is like, we have so many more people producing great, accessible video content on this.
I mean, let's break into that. Let's break into that, because like, something that really affected me and is part of why I wanted to do this podcast was, so I made A Clean Slate, right? My documentary about expungement reform. Very proud of it. Went to all these film festivals, won these awards, goes to streaming. And then I talked with a legislator on this issue. Like, all right, they have a reform bill in their state legislature. They've been stuck in the Senate, haven't been able to get past some procedural issues. And I'm like, all right, can we use this documentary to help out and whatnot? And he just like, he tells me straight up, like, not really. Because at this stage, particularly, it's down to these legislators who use their votes and bills and sponsors and resolutions as currency. Right? Like, I will trade you this if you give me that. And it has nothing to do with like this grassroots thing outside the walls of the Capitol building. It's about like, did the majority whip talk with this person and kind of coordinate this thing? And that for like a week, I was actually like really screwed up on that. Like, I want to help. I want to help this issue. I have these skills to do so. But it seems like it just hits a wall. But that just made me believe, like, all right, number one, I believe like ontologically that like storytelling and human connection is going to be the everlasting need of like human society, right? We're always going to have a need. There's going to be demand for that skill, and having that skill set will be ever important, right? Just how does like plug into impact is what I'm trying to explore. And maybe that just means I have to have a more complicated, complex view of it, and one that is a bit more broader and involves things like community building. So now it's not just about making a documentary and throwing it up on YouTube, right? Like that would be like throwing it up on the YouTube graveyard. Instead, throw it on to, or make it an activation event, get people to show up to an event, make it an excuse for people to have a happy hour around, right? Like there's a more complicated view of making media that's going to have an impact that like we have to learn and adjust to. So what do you see in your field? Like where does media actually fit in, and what kind of media fits in? Like is it, the Mayor of Kingstown? Is that a TV show that moved the needle? The Twin Peaks episode, did that help at all? Like where do we fit in to create stuff that makes a difference in an issue like this?
I think there's two relationships that media could have with a movement like YIMBYism, let's just say. There's one is like the early idea generation and the early like policy development. So like YIMBY kind of sort of exists because a bunch of really precocious bloggers in the early 2010s were like, hey, let's actually just unpack this stuff and have like a conversation about it. And then you get this sort of like elite opinion policy shift happening. You get more people like writing op-eds on these topics. You get eventually books like, for example, the Triumph of the City by Edward Glaser, or The Rent is Too Damn High by Matt Iglesias, or The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein. So like very cerebral like policy development and thinking that sort of disperses these ideas that like maybe everybody in that profession knew about, or everybody in the academic space around that issue knew about, but like normal people had not encountered. So that's, I think, one is like getting the ideas out there and starting something, like starting a conversation. The other is like having a symbiotic relationship with the movement that's actively happening, So like something like YIMBYism is fully baked. We kind of know like the contours of what YIMBYism is and what it's trying to do, but like maybe we need a local content creator who unpacks a specific aspect of that in an accessible way, or unpacks what this means for their particular community, right? So like I was just in Vancouver, and there's this guy, Ute Lee, who's doing a bunch of really great YIMBY content, and it's generally useful, but it's very focused on Vancouver. And everybody that I spoke to in Vancouver was like, have you seen this guy's videos? Right? They're super valuable. They're bringing more people into our movement. And it's like, not at all a dig to him. He's not generating new ideas, but he's bringing ideas down to a local specific context. And it's like, that is equally as valuable and potentially even more valuable in terms of like effectuating change. So I think you're totally right? Like you can go to a university library and find tons of books that are full of like amazing policy ideas, but like if they weren't getting out there, if they weren't broadly accessible, if they weren't transitioning into a community, right? If a community grows up around the issue and becomes passionate about it, and if there wasn't this sustained media campaign around it, it's funny, everybody's joking now about how everybody's starting a podcast now, which is maybe a goofy thing to get at on your inaugural episode. But it's like, on the one hand, wow, yeah, there are a lot of podcasts. On the other hand, the data is pretty clear on this. Like people are consuming insane amounts of media. Like there's clearly actually not enough media. Like people are constantly looking at reels. They're constantly watching YouTube. They're constantly listening to podcasts. I'm trying to like moderate it out a little bit, but it's like, yeah, if I'm cleaning dishes or taking a walk or something, like I'm probably listening to a podcast. So like just flooding the zone with content, I think is really, really, really valuable, and having it sync up with natural conversations that are happening, reinforcing the efforts of broader community organizing, reinforcing the efforts of like specific legislative people. Because in my current job now, I'm the legislative director. So my day-to-day is almost all focused on like reading bills and working with member offices to come up with good ideas and coordinating our allies. And it's like, it's so helpful to me that there's this other ecosystem out there of people who are like, hey, I'm going to explain the concepts that are embedded in what you're doing, but for a mass audience, so that if you're providing more of the cover, you're shifting people's preferences too. Like maybe this is like Meta is like figured out what I want to see and they feed it to me. But it's like whenever I pull up Instagram, I'm getting reels on like, urbanism content, right? Of like, hey, let's, here's how our cities could be better planned. And it's like, that's great. Like 95% of people probably 98% of people who consume that content will never get involved with a YIMBY group. They'll never do anything more. But like we've shifted the broader conversation. And so that 2% that's like I'm into this and I kind of want to make this like a bigger part of my life. They have so much easier of a space that they're working in now, that like these ideas have sort of trickled out and can be fused with more serious advocacy.
I really like how you broke that down. It's like, yeah, early movers are just going to create like pretty, I don't want to say low resource intensive, because writing a book is still pretty resource intensive, but it can be contained within one person and like a press, right? Like it's one person writing the script, and then you get it to the press, and you know they do the deal making. And it's like you have to create like something there for the intelligentsia to even take hold, and then you can disseminate that to the broader public, and that might become more resource intensive. But then there's this issue of like, well, then you have to make it specific for certain contexts, where it's like, well, in terms of a business mindset, like, man, that there seems to be a low revenue backwards up the scale, but that's kind of like, that's the work for like nonprofits and just building a movement, right? Like building a community that's just like, look, I'm ready to support this, I'm ready to show up for this, right? Like it's one where disseminating is the hard part, but that's actually, if you cared about an issue, right, you would do it, right? Like, you would have to just put the effort in and do it.
I'm gonna just pop off on this. All of these nonprofits and like C3s, like, stop putting out reports that are in PDFs. Nobody cares, right? Like, if it's a specific thing that you're gonna put on a member's desk for a specific bill or something like that, that's cool. But even like I'm formerly research director at California YIMBY, so, and I'm working on a PhD, so like I'm all in on like the wonky research stuff. But it's like, should that actually be in the format of a report? That like you look at a report and you're just like, this looks boring. Like the format's boring. It's like it's PDF. Like the PDF report is like blasting you of like, this is boring. This is work. And it's like, it's amazing because it's like, if you took that exact content and like got rid of all the dumb stuff, like the abstract or whatever, and then like all the like wonky citation, if you put it on a Substack, it's like you would probably like literally 100x the number of people who read it. To say nothing of if you just took this report and like communicated it via a like 20-minute YouTube video, you would like 1000x the number of people who would consume it. Or if you like discussed it as part of a podcast Q&A, you would like, 10,000x the number of people who might engage with it. These are like SoftBank numbers, but you take the point, right? Of like, stop, like put content out in a format that like people actually consume. And I see so many groups that are like, well, but we just, we're like a C3 research center. What does a C3 research center do? They put out reports. And it's like, cool. Yeah. If you, maybe your donors are putting pressure on you for stuff like that, but it's like, figure out exactly what you're in the business of doing. And if, definitely we need some people in the space who are doing report style content. I tend to think that's usually going to be like university affiliated research centers. Like let those people have like the great brands. Those people have the brands where it's like they put out a report or a paper on a topic, and that's cool. Like, but for example, an organization like California YIMBY, should we be putting out a lot of reports? No, I don't think so. I think we should put out like almost none. And we'll put out one every now and then as part of like supporting student work or supporting researchers in our network. But I have no illusions about what we're doing there. This is the really valuable stuff, and what we're trying to do, and what I think everybody needs to be doing, is more multimedia, audio, visual content.
Oh, absolutely. I feel like this is something when I was running my libertarian group at NYU. Like our big thing was like every month we should be having a speaker and make a video, like live stream it. Like that's really our job. It's not to have like, it's not to get like dumplings and pizza every Monday and just like talk in a group circle. Like it's about like, we should actually have speakers here talking about real salient issues. We had Brian Kaplan and a few other people like just like tell us about like this policy issue, and we'll invite everybody on campus that we can find who has an interest in this issue, and that was really big actually. And I think like that turned my mind, because at the time I was like an intern at Vice, and I was seeing them kind of like, oh yeah, we've got Vice Impact Studios and whatnot. My head was turning on like, making content is how you actually tell people what's up and get people involved, because otherwise it's like you're just losing out. Like I kind of see it as like a media diet. If you like imagine a plate of your 24 hours in front of you, well, 1/3 of that is sleeping, right? So you got the 2/3 left over. What are you going to fill that with, right? Well, then most people spend time at work, and then people spend time like with some like memes, right? Memes are part of it. Reels, social media. than YouTube's. And yeah, like I'm doing the dishes, I'll put on a podcast. And if I'm like going for a walk or I'm driving for a long time, like those kind of things, that's how you actually contribute to people. Now, tell me a little bit about like who are you trying to target though? Because like, are you trying to target the broad general public? That's obviously helpful in an abstract sense, but I feel like there's like almost limited growth there, where it's like, all right, we got a bunch of randos who may vote next time. They might vote just once every 4 years, unfortunately, and that's not really going to be a big impact. Like, who are we actually trying to get this in front of, and how do we make something that's actually valuable to you? One thing that you said in one of your podcast episodes, where you talked about, was like, look, property taxes are probably the biggest revenue source for a local city. You know, in terms of like, 74% of the revenue comes from property taxes, and so like, they may be concerned about building because, oh, I don't want to spend more on infrastructure, or we're concerned about infrastructure and upgrades, and that's why you have to have impact fees, or that like maybe there's a boon to property values if you can build more, right? Like, is there arguments and people that we should be talking to with creating some of this content that's going to have a bigger impact?
That's a really good question. I mean, in general, I think like content should be driven based on what questions you have or what questions you've received. So like, yeah, I don't know, like go talk to your parents about YIMBYism and what questions do they immediately ask you. That's probably a pretty good clue as to like what most normal people are thinking about this issue. Like, so that's one. Like what are the active areas of debate that are happening? I think another underrated thing, my dissertation advisor said this to me, it's like, ask questions where you don't know the answer, Like, that's also interesting. If you have a question about this policy space where you're like, I'm genuinely unsure, it's probably the case that a lot of other people have the same question, or other people will have this question as they get on your level on the issue. And so like, that's another sort of area of like, that I think is really fantastic. That said, I do think like, as with so many forms of work, it's like, find somebody who is like doing the work and just let them cook, Like, I think orgs like they try to like over engineer, like, hey, what's the specific niche angle or aspect of this issue? And you get these like hyper refined messages or like pieces of content that usually are things that have like, they kind of fade into the background, because when you ask people like, how do you like having this issue of housing discussed? It's like they're usually telling you something that they've already heard a half dozen times. And so it's like, if you want to like do ChatGPT style content of like, here's the prevailing consensus and like, here's the thing that's already been done a dozen times, cool, do a lot of that outreach. If you want to like really drive the conversation in weird ways, you got to like find creators and be comfortable letting them take things in weird directions that don't always make sense in the near term, So I think this is another thing too, is like, and let them do it for a long time. And this is like every like nonprofit, they start to get it, and then they're like, or every advocacy org, they're like, wow, we need to do more video content. And then they're like, wow, that was a lot more expensive than we'd expected. We put out 3 videos, we didn't get the viewership that we wanted. Well, we can't justify it. And it's like, this is a thing that takes years. Like, and I know that like, this doesn't fit with like nonprofit industrial complex of like, well, we did the thing, here was our inputs, here was our outputs.
They have to produce a report to their donors every year, every fiscal year, and then they get heat over something that doesn't seem like it's maximizing value, right?
Well, you got to give more like time for stuff like this to see if it's even going to work. I mean, there's just nothing that's relevant to my mind that's like high impact on day one. Like you go like Joe Rogan, it's like him goofing off with like maybe a few dozen people for like the first 2 or 3 years that he's doing this, right? And now he's like probably the most important content creator, one of the most important content creators on earth. And this is the sort of project that like no like serious type A person trying to advance an issue would ever have said like, let's pursue that strategy. But he did, and now any issue that he cares about like is massively elevated.
That's a really good way of putting it. Like the kind of person who flourishes within a certain like working context of like nonprofits or planning strategy and all that stuff. That personality is not really conducive to the relationship building that is necessary for some like key advocacy work, right? Like people wanted to just goof off with Joe Rogan because he was the host of, Fear Factor and, UFC guy, comedian guy, right? Like, and that there's no planning there to become like, yes, we will then have an impact on who becomes president of the United States. But it's like, clearly, like, that's the goal of what some of these like strategists and type A people want. And what I think, what everybody wants, right? We all want to solve an issue. We all want to play a part in it's doing something really important. But like, well, how you do it, unfortunately, is kind of like through relationship building. And that's a whole different skill set than being like laser focused on, I want to do this, I want to do that. And now it's like, well, you have to be able to goof off. You have to be able to like kind of go wherever it takes you and be creative in that sense. I guess that's the abstract issue there, right?
Yeah, I mean, there's so much competing for consumers' attention, and consumers are like hyper aware of like when something feels corporate or like hyper focus grouped or is not saying anything original. I think most people are extremely good at figuring that out, and so it's like, if you can't offer that, then yeah, don't waste your time, right? And usually that involves a little bit of an auteur, of like, okay, we're gonna let this person do videos their way, and
Right.
if you don't think that's the right person for it, then don't do it. But
Right.
we have this like worst of both worlds approach to it, where we're like, okay, like we're gonna let you do this, but we're gonna review your work, and we want to review everything, and like it's gonna take like 6 months to get a video out or a podcast out, and it's just like, it doesn't matter. It's just a waste, right? It's like, be lean. That's another thing too. Is like do the cheapest version. Maybe this is bad for like somebody who runs a videographer contract. But it's like, do the cheap version and just get it out, right?
Yeah,
like
yeah.
do the like I minimum viable product, right? It's a meme for a reason. It's like, you definitely like, there's value in these like hyper produced, extended, very thoughtful, methodical videos, and like most serious orgs should be doing those. But like, part of the genius of podcasting is it's just so incredibly cheap and so incredibly easy to like get this content out. Like, that's good, right? Like that's a feature. Like, it's so cheap to get this stuff out. It should cost you nothing.
We only have a few more minutes. Let me ask you, in your field of work, what is it that you think someone like me, someone with at least my skill set of being in video, of being in media, should be doing to help you? Like, your day-to-day, you need to talk with legislators. You're like, man, I wish this legislator would just be like on level, he's on level 1 right now. I wish he was on level 5 on this issue. And it could be really aided if there was just some kind of large media stuff that was out there for him to consume, right? Or like this lady on the council, like, she cares about this issue, but she doesn't yet see the connection between, environmental policy and infill development yet. I wish there's something tying that together, right? Tell me about like what kind of work that someone like me could be doing to aid your work.
I mean, I would say we just got to keep flooding the zone with content, and like different types of people telling the story in slightly different ways, and in slightly different formats. Like, we've not even scratched the surface of that. It's funny because like me on the wonk side, it's like, I was talking to somebody and they're like, oh, there's a bunch of people becoming like zoning land use people. Are you threatened by that? And I'm like, there's so much work. There's like, we're all going to eat. Like, there's so much to be done on this that I'm not even remotely threatened by it. And it's like, I'm trying to put the work in to stay at the frontier of the issue. I'm not threatened. Like, if you're like getting, comfortable and lazy, yeah, you should be threatened by new people coming in. So like, there's so much like just appetite for stuff. And I would reinforce this of like more content on specific places. Like what, like, one of the things that we occasionally hear is like, oh, YIMBY, that's a California thing. How could that make sense for like a place like where I'm from, Kentucky, or where you're from, Michigan? And it's like, yeah, I can understand why that's not totally intuitive. Let me tell that story to you. Let me tell you the story about segregation in Detroit. Let me tell you the story about actually Grand Rapids has a housing shortage, and here's why. Like, I remember, growing up in a place like Lexington, you virtually never see like good quality content on the place where you're from. So it's like, there might be, how many like people in their like 20s and 30s are like on Instagram in Grand Rapids, and then like Calvin comes up and is like, hey, let's talk about the history of zoning in Grand Rapids and why you can't afford a home. Like, that is so cool and so powerful. Like, local like cities and like mid-sized cities, states, like, just so much more content is needed on all these contexts.
All these local contexts are starved for being a part of the conversation, and that's, if you're an entrepreneur, like that's a need to fill, right? Like I just remember like someone mentioned Grand Rapids in Secession, and people are freaking out about it here. It's like, oh my God, we were mentioned in the show, and that alone is like a signal that like there's a need for people to see themselves in national context or these big issues, and to see how they can contribute. And if that's the role of media makers, I think that's absolutely a role we can fill, right? Absolutely, absolutely.
No, I mean, just in the home stretch here, yeah, just local, I see so many great content creators who are like, yeah, I'm just like filming myself walking out of the like public hearing, sharing what happened and my thoughts, and then I post it on, to Reels. And it's like, cool, that's good, right? That's so useful. And I would add too, like, if you have any doubts about doing this, like a lot of people do this stuff and then it becomes a career. So like, obviously, I think most people do this stuff because they're just like, obviously, virtually everybody in this space is here because it's like, I was passionate about it, I had a good job, and then I was like, okay, actually, maybe this should be my career. Like, that's almost everybody in this space. Like, everybody you encounter here is like, I had a good job in marketing or tech, or I had a good, easy civil service job, but I felt an overwhelming need to do this work. So like, that's another aspect of it too, is that, if you're especially a younger person fresh out of college trying to think about like where to commit your energies, doing this kind of work on an issue like housing affordability and urbanism in YIMBY is, I think, a great way to focus.
Absolutely. Nolan, thank you for unpacking this whole situation with me. I really appreciate it. This is the kind of stuff that gives me a sense of true north, or like an illuminated light leading forward, because it's just like, once you kind of break down, here's where we actually fit in, rather than, oh, let's make a video that's going to be, gain some awards, gain some notability, but then goes nowhere, right? Like that can be deflating. So I think really contributing to the issue, this is what I want to do. I'm really glad that you're able to help me out on that one. Thanks so much for being on the podcast.
Yeah, my pleasure. Good luck with it.